Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And I know some of you listen to me while you play your jigsaw puzzle, and some of you drink coffee while you listen to me, and others, there's a lady who walks her dog while she listens to me. So I want to send love to each and every one of you, wherever you are and whatever it is that you may be doing, whether it's day or whether it's night. You are so welcome to the channel, and I do hope you're doing exceedingly well. So I want to send you lots of love, and before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Paisley and I'm from London in England, and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in West Virginia in North America in 1987, when I was 21 years old at the time. I grew up in Notting Hill in London, a single daughter of two very hard-working parents, who both worked in central London as insurance brokers near Fenchurch Street. We lived in a symmetrical, aesthetically pleasing Georgian-style apartment block with the quintessential whitewashed walls, symmetrical windows and shutters. All the houses in our street reflected the same square regimental style of architecture, with pediments, arches and columns, which I believe made our area very aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Notting Hill nowadays is an up-and-coming prestigious part of London and home to a handful of celebrities, but it is still a great area for raising a family and is a thriving social interactive community, but a little on the expensive side, I have to admit. I loved growing up in Notting Hill because we were pretty much close to everything. You could walk everywhere on foot, which was wonderfully convenient. There was Kensington Gardens around the corner, where we took our mischievous wire-haired terrier Molly Moo for her daily walks. It was around a beautiful park there, with expansive green lawns and pretty trees. Then if you turned a corner you would find Westbourne Grove, where you can find those trendy and exclusive boutiques. And then to the west is my favourite spot of all. That's where the famous Portobello Market is, where you find all those quaint little market stalls and intriguing-looking shops. And nowadays there's also a plethora of restaurants and pubs to be found in the area as well. I absolutely adored going to the markets and finding some bargains at the market store, which was personally far more exciting for me than buying clothes at a fancy-pantsy store or boutique. I always like striking bargains with the local traders. That's part of the fun, and I enjoy that kind of shopping as it gives you that false glorified feeling that you've got something for nothing. I also loved piling my basket with fresh local produce to bring back home, like fish from the fishmonger and fresh fruit and vegetables direct from the market. It was a thriving metropolitan city to grow up in, which was lively and fun, and the people were terribly friendly and congenial, and some of the locals were real characters with a huge sense of humour. For the first few years I attended a very good local school in the area, but when my father was transferred to Edinburgh in Scotland for a short-term assignment in his job, both my parents decided it would be best to send me to boarding school for my senior years of school, which is rarely where my story begins. My boarding school was a huge red-bricked, rather attractive, imposing-looking building with large symmetrical classroom windows. It was surrounded with undulating emerald green lawns and a scattering of pretty trees on the ground. Then there was large areas of arched corridors that you would expect to find in any school, where the kids would use as a point of access to migrate from one classroom to another between lessons. Funny enough, I took to boarding school rather like a duck to water, and was exceedingly quick to establish some lifelong friends. But there were the inevitable setbacks of being far away from home in Notting Hill. I missed my fun-loving parents so very much, especially my adorable dad. I also yearned for the freedom that I had when I was living in that bustling neighbourhood where there was so much to do in the thriving metropolitan community, with never a dull moment to be had. We used to have a saying in London that if you were tired of London, you were quite literally tired of life. I remember in those days at boarding school, we just adored receiving post from our loved ones, and it was always the most exciting part of the day to get a letter. The head prefect would come down to the playground where we were sitting in circles, cross-legged on the grass, having our little chats during tea break. I remember in her hand she would be carrying a large pile of post, and as she read the names out on the letters, I would always hold my breath, hoping with all my heart that there would be a letter in that large pile, especially for me, and that the prefect would invariably call out my name. If I did get a letter, it felt as thrilling and riveting as receiving a Christmas present that I could not wait to tear open. I remember my hands would literally tremble and my heart would flutter with excitement as I tore open the envelope and extracted the papery contents. I would retreat to a safe corner of the playground to read my letter, and it would be the inevitable highlight of my day. If I did not receive a letter, I remember I was so bitterly disappointed. I invariably felt as if my heart would sink, and I would look longingly at my friends who were reading their post. Truly, I felt like a dog with an empty bowl, and all the people who had received letters were having state dinners, and I was having absolutely nothing, only staring at an empty plate like a half-starved street dog. I promise you I'm not exaggerating when I say that I would salivate over their letters and look upon their papery treasures with a touch of the green-eyed monster. You see, I grew up in the 80s era, so we did not have the sophisticated internet connections that people have today for that instant communication, and so the only way to hear from someone was either through long-distance phone calls, telegrams or post. I assure you, receiving post was the best feeling in the entire world, and a great deal more romantic than Facebook and Twitter of today. I can assure you of that categorically, because there is something about the expectancy of receiving a letter that was so electrifying. Every day after school we were expected to spend some time in the library, either reading books or catching up on homework. One day when I was shuffling around in the library, I discovered this international magazine, which I observed at the back had a long list of names and addresses of people around the world who were looking for pen pals. The first thought that came into my mind was having a few pen pals would certainly mean a whole lot more letters for me to open, and that was a very exciting prospect indeed. I could feel that familiar fluttering of excitement rising up in my heart as I envisaged all these foreign letters being delivered to my school, all addressed to me. I could barely contain my enthusiasm as I jotted down 3 names of potential pen pals to write to. One was to a boy called Nigel Dixon from Bombay in India. I liked the sound of his name. Another was Nicholas Freeman from Wellington in New Zealand. And the final letter was to James Daniels from West Virginia in North America. Before long, all 3 young men had all replied to me, and there began my long-distance friendships with these 3 individuals who literally wrote me the most incredible, detailed and charming letters. And when I say incredible, I mean literally pages of really interesting stories, all about their extraordinary lives. Before long, I was the envy of all my girlfriends who couldn't understand why I was receiving such exotic-looking mail, and were very envious of the vast streams of post flowing my way like a gushing current of beautiful paper envelopes from very exciting places abroad with very intriguing postal stamps. I warmed to all of my pen pals almost immediately and enjoyed receiving their enthralling letters. Nigel Dixon was a scuba diver in India. Nicholas Freeman was obsessed with rugby and wanted to play for the New Zealand team one day. But it was my friendship with James Daniels that seems to take on a romantic twist in this papery world of global interaction. I was to realise that we had so many interests in common, and his letters were always so funny and articulate. James lived in West Virginia in an exquisite farmhouse surrounded by beautiful, ravishing views, and he spent so much of his time hunting, fishing and exploring. Every time I received a letter from James, my friends would tell me that my skin would flush a bright pink colour and my blue eyes would light up like a Christmas tree, and I would wear a besotted puppy dog expression on my face. Before long, James and I exchanged photographs, and I really adored the look of the rugged young gentleman with the curly dark hair and the sultry-looking hazel eyes that I saw smiling back at me in the photographs. I would tell my girlfriends that I was falling for James, who was about 2 years my senior. I told them that I was certain that he was the man for me. My friends would tell me that I was in love with the idea of love, and I couldn't possibly fall for someone that I'd actually never met before. They expressed that I was just being big, soppy, incurable romantic that literally believed in fairy tales. They were telling me that sadly life wasn't like that, and you'll probably find that he's the biggest tosser when you do actually finally get to meet him. I knew in my gut that they were very, very wrong. One day James urged me to fly from the United Kingdom to America and come to West Virginia to spend a couple of weeks with his family in their idyllic countryside home. I begged my dad to let me go, and usually my dad had a tendency to give in to me, as he always referred to me as his blue-eyed girl, so it wasn't surprising for me when he agreed to my eager request. I still remember the day that James collected me from the airport. He was standing there with this massive bouquet of stunning-looking flowers in his hands, and when I went through to arrivals with my trolley, I saw him glancing in my direction with a huge, engaging smile on his face. I remember my heart was pounding like a heavy drum, and adrenaline was coursing through my veins with an exuberant anxiety. This was the moment I'd been longing for a very long time, and now it was finally happening. It was almost too good to be true. The moment we saw each other, we literally ran into each other's arms, as if we'd known each other all our lives. It was weird, but I expected to feel shy and rather reticent, but the excitement of seeing him overcame all my inhibitions, and even though we'd never articulated it in words, from that point on, we were very definitely a couple. It was unequivocally love at first sight, and James also told me that as cynical as he had always been about falling in love with someone over a pen and paper, it most assuredly had happened to him long before he even met me. "It was in your second letter you wrote to me," he said, "when you revealed that you and your best friend had sneakily slipped some green dye into your matron's hairspray bottle when she wasn't looking. Once she'd finished preening herself with lashings of hairspray, she was seen walking around the school with bright green hair, and the headmistress said, 'Mrs. Gwen, I do not know why you think such a hair colour is appropriate for a school of our standing, but it looks positively ridiculous on a woman of your advancing years. And you've made a ridiculous spectacle of yourself this morning. All the kids are sniggering and laughing at your expense. What on earth possessed you to dye your hair such a luminescent, atrocious colour? God only knows. I would be very much obliged if you would kindly revert back to your original blonde colour, which, if I may say, was a lot more becoming on you.' When the matron rushed to the bathrooms to see what the headmistress was actually talking about, and regarded her horrifying luminescent green hair in the mirror, her mortified screams could be heard all over the school and down every corridor, and after that your matron became known as Mrs. Greengwen, and the name just stuck." "That's right," I said. "Did you like that story?" "Oh, I loved it. In that moment I knew you were the one for me. You're mischievous, and I really like that a lot. Apart from anything else," he continued, "you're much more beautiful than your picture, but then everything about you is gorgeous, from your cute little upturned nose and to the dimples around your cheeks when you smile." I have to say that I also found James to be much more handsome in the flesh than in his photograph. I loved his mop of curly dark hair and his beautiful hazel eyes, not to mention his large ravishing smile that would make my heart miss a beat every time. Naturally, I was delighted to meet James's entire family, and they were the warmest people with such an easygoing attitude to life that I found incredibly endearing and very charming. They welcomed me into their home as if I was already part of their family, and went out of their ways to be extraordinarily hospitable towards me. James lived on a large, sumptuous property in a very rural, large 1800s-style farmhouse with exquisite mountainous views, rocky ridges, rolling green countryside, an exquisite silvery lake, ponds, several rustic-looking barns, and then vast areas of natural woods that consisted primarily of red and chestnut oaks, sugar maples, American beeches, hickory and white walnut trees. Even better, the thriving woods on his property was teeming with indigenous wildlife, such as groundhogs, cottontail rabbits, squirrels, skunks, red foxes, chipmunks, raccoons, and my favourite of all, the very serene, ever so gentle white-tailed deer. I was also taken by James's family on many occasions to visit the picturesque town of Bridgeport for some fine dining opportunities, and also to visit some of the artsy and rather trendy curio shops there, where James brought me a heart-shaped locket, which I still have today, with a picture of the two of us inside when we first met. One day when James was working night shift in Bridgeport, helping his uncle with running their family restaurant, I was pretty much left to my own devices. James' parents had been invited to a barbecue with friends, and they urged me to come along. In truth, I just wanted some space to myself, so I encouraged them to just please go to the party without me. I've always enjoyed my own space, so it felt very good to be on my own. I decided to go and pick some walnuts from the walnut tree very late in the afternoon. I made my way to the wooded area with a basket clasped in my hands. I'd never been into the woods before, and I was actually amazed that James hadn't taken me in here yet. It was such an exquisite area, filled with large, tall, imposing trees, which were like statuesque green giants, rising up in the firmament, and they were so old that all I could see was their very solid bark-like foundations, because even the lower branches seemed to tower above me at a great height. This cooling canopy the trees created was like a vast umbrella above my head, but there were areas between the branches where the sunlight filtered through, creating pretty prisms of light that danced on the creeping ground cover below. I noticed that these woods were very well maintained because there were distinct man-made earthen pathways everywhere, especially for hiking, I imagine. And then there were ferns and pretty cascading undergrowth that created a soft green carpet on the ground. I also loved the way the green moss literally clung to the tree branches like a very tactile, furry green wallpaper. It was utterly enchanting and very mesmerising. I also realised to my amazement that I could actually hear the sound of water cascading through the woods, and I could feel the gentle wet spray shower my face in a fresh mist. I ascertained that there must be a waterfall close by, and I was right. I watched in awe as the foaming white water cascaded down these sculptural rocky heights to the lower stream that then ultimately meandered through the woods. There were no words to describe how breathtaking it all was. The forest was alive with pretty birdsong, and I can honestly say that I literally danced through those woods because it was such an incredible privilege to be surrounded by such exquisite scenery that quite literally took my breath away. Suddenly I saw a white-tailed deer who was chewing its cud and twitching its tail, and for a moment I stood very still as I watched in awe, but after a while it scampered away. As I reached the white walnut trees, I discovered a very large deerskin on the ground that was filled with walnuts, which surprised me because if this was private property, which I gathered it was, what on earth were all these walnuts doing in this animal pelt, I wondered. I was a little concerned that there might just be a stranger or trespasser around. I decided I would take the walnuts and the skin and place them in my own basket, as after all they did belong to James's family and not to some trespasser on the land. At that very moment a huge form stepped out of the undergrowth, and I was so startled that I was unable to scream. I just stood there in silence with my mouth wide open in shock. I noticed that the creature was very colossal in size. It was a humanoid in appearance, covered in long, flowing brown hair. It really rather reminded me of those pictures you see of early man, as he invariably evolves from an ape to a human, sort of in between that. I think the thing that really stunned me the most was the sheer titanic proportions of this great, mighty beast. I would say he was about 900 pounds, 8 foot tall and 4 foot wide, with very overlong arms, powerful, strong legs, and human-like, very large hands and feet. I could tell that the critter was built like an army tank, because he was solid, brawny, sinewy and muscular, and those humongous shoulders of his were nothing to be sneezed at. The creature had a cone-shaped head and a very angular pointed face, and I noticed deep-set treacle-brown eyes, a very flat nose, and an exceedingly thin mouth. It made a low, guttural warning growl at me that sounded rather like a dog protecting his bone from a challenger, and then it grabbed my basket from me and poured all the walnuts back into his animal skin. This was when I realised suddenly that the creature was not happy that I'd actually swiped his walnuts. I wanted to make up for my transgression, so I proceeded to pick some nuts off the ground and put them back into the animal skin as a way of saying, "Sorry for pinching your stash," to the strange creature. When he saw that I was gathering nuts for him off the ground, the creature actually looked rather pleased, and the former aggression that he had displayed towards me suddenly just dissipated. The creature squatted under the tree, eating the walnuts by popping them in his mouth happily like a box of popcorn. Once he had, of course, extracted them from their shell, which he prized open effortlessly with his thick fingers. The creature watched me hunched over on my falls, gathering the nuts for him and placing them into the animal skin. He seemed very jubilant to let me do all the hard work for him, while he took it very easy, snacking under the tree and watching me with rather interested eyes. I surreptitiously reached into the animal skin to eat a walnut that I'd noticed had fallen out of its shell, and the animal snatched it from my hand and stuffed it greedily into his mouth. He looked at me with an animated expression on his face as if to say, "That's mine, not yours, and I'm definitely not sharing." His expression was so comical that I actually had to laugh out loud. When I'd finished gathering my contribution of walnuts for the hairy critter, he got up and shook the walnut tree incredibly hard with his overlong arms that seemed like hailstones of walnuts were suddenly falling off the tree and carpeting the entire ground. The creature pointed at the ground and his animal skin as if to say, "Get the rest for me." I giggled. "Sorry, I've done my part," I said. "You want them? You pick them up yourself," I said. The creature pointed to the ground, making an indignant chattering sound, and then he threw me a walnut to eat. I think he decided that giving me a small quota of walnuts might actually mean I'd do all the dirty work for him and gather all the fallen nuts off the ground. I fell for the creature's manipulative tactics and gathered the rest of the nuts for him, but to give him his dues, he did dutifully put some of the fallen nuts into my basket as some kind of restitution for me. The creature patted the ground as if encouraging me to sit down near him, which I did, and then he tossed me a few of the walnuts that he'd cracked open, and we sat there eating for a while together as the afternoon faded and the dusk finally rolled in. In the distance I could hear the hoot of an owl, and to my absolute amazement the creature made a very similar owl hoot back, as though returning a call. He then gathered his nuts together in the deerskin, and he bound it together in his hands like a large bag. The critter nodded in my direction quickly, as if he was saying cheerio, and then he glided back into the forest with such a seamless grace. I could hardly believe what I'd just seen. For a long time I had absolutely no idea what in fact the critter was that I'd encountered, and even though I did describe it very clearly to James's family, they all thought I'd encountered a bear. But when I assured them that I'd gathered nuts for the creature, they were more than a little perturbed as to what the hairy humanoid could actually be, because they'd never, ever seen something like that before. It was only later on in my life, after James and I were married with children of our own, that I observed a programme on television all about Bigfoots, and I was exceedingly excited to tell James that this was indeed the creature that I'd encountered in the woods on his parents' land. I gathered from the footage that the Bigfoots are elusive and reticent creatures, and it appears many of them are quite aggressive and very frightening. I do not recall being afraid of the Bigfoot that I encountered, but that was because he was like a giant human covered in hair that was really very congenial towards me. That was after the first hint of aggression. I do know that if he had been very aggressive to me, it would have been a terrifying interaction because of his sheer size. I'm only glad I encountered a friendly boy who was a little on the lazy side and really rather possessive over the walnuts. To be honest, I really quite warmed to the hairy critter, and I was only sad that I never got to see him again. I hope he's still out there, though, pilfering walnuts and getting his miners to gather them for him, while he sits back enjoying the high life. As you've gathered by my story, I did subsequently marry the man of my dreams, and we are now happily living in West Virginia in a delightful farmhouse ourselves. So all the doubters and sceptics from my boarding school years who believed that it was impossible to fall in love with your pen pal just from writing letters to each other, you were very wrong. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to thank you so very much, Paisley, for such an incredible story. Wow, I loved it. And it's just incredible to think of you finding your pen pal in the back of a magazine and writing to him, and now he's your husband, and then coming all the way from the UK and spending a day in the forest and so many Americans looking to encounter Bigfoot, and you just go happily hunting for some walnuts and you have an encounter with the hairy man yourself. You are very, very lucky. Until next time, goodbye and good night.